Hi, everybody. My name is Amanda Stronza, and I'm calling you all the way from Botswana, recording this from Botswana. And I'm very happy to have the opportunity to talk with all of you. And I'm delighted to be sharing some of my own insights about ecotourism from my long-term research in the Peruvian Amazon. And I'm going to go full screen and shut myself down here a little bit. So the title of my presentation is Ecotourism, Assessing Local Effects in One Amazon Community Over Time. Ecotourism is a concept that's popular, but often misinterpreted, and as I'm sure many of us have seen, falsely advertised. It's basically just nature tourism, but with the added proactive effort to make tourism work in positive ways for the environment and for local communities. It's often described as a win-win-win option for sustainability. It's said to offer, quote, a promising route for generating benefits for those living close to tropical biodiversity without undermining its existence. So it's a go-to example of sustainable development or of using the market for conservation. In reality, ecotourism seldom lives up to these ideals, and not everyone wants to be an ecotourist. But for lots of communities around the world, ecotourism has become a doorway, in a sense, to the global economy. As people build lodges, hiking trails, and canopy towers in their communities, they're gaining a foothold in capitalist markets and ushering in many changes for themselves. For better or for worse, these changes are also affecting local and global common pool resources. So what are common pool resources? They are essentially the things that are difficult to divide up or to fence in, things that people share, things like fisheries, forests, beaches, rivers, wildlife. Precisely the things many of us, I would assume, in this conversation, this virtual conversation, precisely the things we want to protect. Common pool resources share two things that have direct relevance to ecotourism. One is controlling access, and the other is preventing individuals from degrading the resource for all others. Scholars of commons have referred to these two problems as exclusion and subtraction. Though ecotourism and common pool resource management have been the focus of a lot of research over the past couple of decades, I would say relatively few people have studied the linkages between the two. And this is really strange. It's strange because when we think about the importance of commons for making tourism destinations what they are, you'd think everyone would be thinking about the need for common pool resource management. What would a diving trip be without the sea turtles? What would a visit to Niagara be without the falls? But also, when common pool resources like wildlife, forest, landscapes are marketed as destinations, as ecotourism destinations, they often become more difficult to manage. This is partly because the ways in which they're used or perceived or governed shift under ecotourism. No longer the domain of solely local needs and practices, they become the focal point of outsiders' desires and imaginations too. That is, the resources, the wildlife or the lake or whatever resource it is, it shifts from being a local commons to a global commons. So in this way, a new ecotourism development can compound the problem of exclusion by advertising, let's say, for the first time, a beach, a secluded beach, to tour operators and tourists. But then what happens? This is why we tend to say a beach through tourism can become spoiled. Ecotourism can also exacerbate the problem of subtraction by expanding the number of users and generating revenues that can create greater or more efficient exploitation, greater ways of taking all those common pool resources like shells that you're seeing on the beach. in this light, ecotourism seems like a really bad idea for conservation. On the other hand, maybe, just maybe, ecotourism can provide precisely the right economic incentives and the right social conditions to strengthen the local management of common pool resources, in this case, gorillas. If this is true, ecotourism may be an answer to many of our conservation challenges. So my research is about trying to understand this and disentangle these ideas. The question I'm asking, including today, is how does ecotourism strengthen or debilitate local management of the commons? There's plenty of evidence to show that ecotourism can provide incentives for conservation. But there's a lot to show, too, that the industry can tear away or erode local traditions for resource management and ultimately signal the demise of cultural or biological diversity. My plan today is to offer a case study from my long-term work in Peru, and along the way, identify 3 factors that I would say indicate ecotourism is a way of strengthening commons management, and 3 ways that ecotourism has a tendency, or can have a tendency, to weaken local commons management. I've been carrying out ethnographic research in this corner of the Amazon since 1993. Madre de Dios is a place of rapid growth in tourism, ecotourism specifically. My focus has been on this community of Infierno, which is in the department of Madre de Dios, and it's just 21 kilometers from the capital town of Puerto Maldonado, and it's just outside of the Bahuaja-Sunene National Park, in the buffer zone, in fact. My research in Infierno has been about trying to understand this feedback between ecotourism itself, the resulting changes in the local community, and the ultimate management of common pool resources like forests, lakes, and wildlife. My story is part of a longitudinal study that I've been carrying out in collaboration with the community since 1996. This includes baseline data as well as subsequent interviews over the years. You can see a lapse for past several years since I've been in Botswana, alas. Going back to this slide for a moment, I'm going to zoom into a satellite image that will show us this area here. From here, you can see the outline of the territory of the community of Infierno. It's a commonly held land, a native titled territory of 154 families that share common access to nearly 10,000 hectares of forest that straddled both sides of the Tambopata River. This is the Tambopata River. A relatively small percentage of those 10,000 hectares have been deforested. Recent estimates are under 10% of their forests, and you can see the clearings are mostly along the river edges where you find the alluvial soils. If you zoom in a little more, you see that this is essentially small-scale agriculture, 2 to 3 hectares cleared at a time. And when we talk about ecotourism as a tool for conservation in places like this, we're talking about it essentially as an alternative to this kind of land use, which in the scheme of conservation challenges of potential land uses, I would say this land use is quite benign. And if we zoom in farther, we can see the most intensive agriculture and the rotation of fields is around the center of the community where you have the soccer field. This is a mixed economy, subsistence production and agriculture, extraction of forest products, and primarily Brazil nuts, but also some timber. There is some small-scale gold mining. But people here are though they're producing for themselves, they're also all integrated with the market economy in Puerto Maldonado, and they are part of the cash economy, and in that way, already part of Western society. Ecotourism has not been their first introduction to the cash economy. As we would expect in this part of the Amazon, lots of biodiversity, an incredible diversity of across the taxa of species. And though Infierno is a native titled land, under the name of the Ese-Eja indigenous group, it's a culturally diverse place with residents from the highlands of Peru, Quechua-speaking people, as well as the Ribereños and Mestizos. So though the community is outside the national park, it is a social ecological system of great importance for everyone, for people in this region as well as in the broader region of the Amazon and Peru as a nation for the world. Between the two Oxbow lakes that are part of Infierno's territory, years ago, the community established a reserve of their own of 2,000 hectares to help protect some of that diversity I just talked about. And if you look closely, you'll see what looks to be like a small clearing. In fact, it's a complex of thatched buildings. And in fact, that complex is the community's ecotourism lodge, which is called Posada Amazonas. The lodge opened in 1998 with a $500,000 investment from a bilateral agreement. It can accommodate up to 60 guests per night who pay just over $100. They feature a 40-meter canopy tower from which you can look out over the Tambopata River and those anthropogenic forests of Infierno. And among the many wildlife attractions here, this area features several active harpy eagle nests. And from the Oxbow Lakes, tourists are paddled around on this catamaran, where they are likely, or hopeful, I should say, to see a family of giant otters. Like harpy eagles, these animals, as many of you probably know, are top predators in the rainforest, right up there with jaguars and caimans. The people of Infierno have fished this lake. This is Lake Tres Chimbadas, and farmed around it for the past 40 years. And in the process, really taking care of these otters. And so I just want to emphasize that though this community is outside of the national park, the people of Infierno have in many ways been stewards of the biodiversity in Tambopata, and even before ecotourism. Posada Amazonas has been booked solid almost since it opened, mostly to upscale clients from dozens of international companies in the United States and Europe. A few years ago, they were featured in Outside Magazine as one of the top 10 eco-lodges in the world. They've gotten awards from the United Nations, Conservation International, and others. It's been featured in such magazines as The Economist and in the New York Times. This image captures one of the reasons this lodge has gotten the attention it has. I took this photo back in 1996 during one of countless community meetings when the members of Infierno met with the man in the middle. His name is Eduardo Nicander, and he's co-owner of a tourism company from Lima called Rainforest Expeditions. He and his company came together with the people of Infierno to form what became a joint venture partnership. After nearly a year of negotiations, culminating in that photo, the partners signed a 20-year contract in 1996, in which they agreed to split profits, 60% to the community and 40% to the company. Importantly, they also agreed to share equally in the operation and management of the lodge. So to make that joint venture work, that partnership work, they formed, among many other strategies, they formed a 10-person committee, this ecotourism committee, that's elected by a communal assembly. And there's a rotation of 2 years. They meet, this committee is like a board of directors, and they meet regularly, at least once a month, with the company. And they make all kinds of decisions, everything from who gets hired for what, to what the salaries should be, to administration and marketing, and how profits should be reinvested. Once they signed that contract in '96, the partnership really began with the construction of the lodge itself. From the very beginning, the community was extremely involved. It took 2 years to build this lodge, all of the thatch hand woven and collected from the community. All of this labor required significant coordination, and this was carried out by the community members as well. Tremendous leadership there. Once the lodge opened in '98, most of the positions were filled right away by community members. Guides began as apprentices until they mastered the language and were able to speak with tourists. And today there are 10 local guides. But this facet of their participation, the true sharing of decisions and management, and their real involvement and ownership of Posada Amazonas has been critical for a lot of the results that I'm sharing with you today. This is really a community-run lodge, not just in name, but truly in practice. So to date, the lodge has generated over $2 million in local income. In 2007 alone, profits were $135,000. This was just the community's share of the total profits that year. Additional returns every year come through the sale of handicrafts, agricultural goods. They get, when they get awards and donations, it goes directly to the community, not through the company. About 80% of the profits that come back to the community are divided among the families, and then they save 20% to reinvest in their share of the operation. Going back to this image for a moment, I want to highlight a couple of things. One, you can see that Infierno lies between relatively unfragmented forests in the south and relatively high deforestation just north of them, and that's associated with the interoceanic highway that connects Brazil with Peru. So I bring this to your attention just to point out that conservationists are focusing a lot of attention on this one community as a buffer between a lot of biodiversity in forest here and a lot of change in land cover and biodiversity to the north. So there's a lot of attention to this very question we're discussing today, is how are people here managing their communal resources, and how is ecotourism either helping or hindering what they're doing? There are many commons in this case. The land itself, as we said, 10,000 hectares is shared by the families, but also the bodies of water, access to the river, the Oxbow Lakes, the wildlife, clearly, but also we can think of cultural heritage as a kind of a commons that people share as well. So what are the effects of this enterprise on commons management? First, considering factors in favor, and I said there would be 3 factors that ecotourism does to strengthen common pool resource management here. One is simply the new earnings that have come from, the profits that have come from the enterprise. The share that goes to the families has resulted in an average increase of 25% over annual household income. And there's also 20 to 25 people at any given time who are directly employed in the lodge. So these economic changes have represented direct financial incentives for conservation. When the lodge was built, the community expanded that communal reserve I'd mentioned from 2,000 hectares to 3,000 hectares, effectively protecting 30% of their territory. And in this area, they prohibited hunting, timber harvesting, and any form of farming. Employment opportunities also have had a direct effect on resource use. The staff people, those 20 to 25 people, partly because they live at the lodge, which was a half-day trip from where most people live in the center of the community, because they have to live at the lodge. Most employees simply do not have time to engage in hunting or forest extraction or agriculture. So this has resulted in a couple of ways, in a decrease in direct reliance on natural resources and an incentive to expand the protected area. A second factor in favor of strengthening common pool resource management is through what I would call management experience. Community has gained a great deal of collective action abilities or organizational skills by co-managing this operation. Since their partnership, they've devoted considerable time to discussing and enforcing rules for how resources in their common lands should be used, especially in relation to ecotourism. So, for example, when a couple of men were caught hunting in the reserve, which, by the way, is where the ecotourism lodge is, the community as shareholders came together to determine appropriate sanctions, and they decided to withhold those hunters' tourism profits for that year. This was not a decision made by anyone in the government or even the tourism company, but rather by the community themselves. Other rules of this kind are constantly being devised, again, not by outsiders, but by community members themselves. And I think that points to clear strength in a local institution for managing wildlife and their forest resources. People have also pooled their profits in another form of collective action to protect their communal land. When the Interoceanic Highway came under construction, it's now paved. The development and opening of that land occurred just within 7 kilometers of that Oxbow Lake, where the giant otters are. So in a remarkable example of collective action, the community decided to pool $12,000 of their own earnings from tourism to petition the government for rights to a 2,000-hectare ecotourism concession, essentially expanding their commons, expanding the protected area of their commons, all with the aim of helping protect those otters, which they saw as a key resource for their tourism operation, from people settling along the highway. Third, since the lodge opened, the community has become part of a wider social network, and this includes connections with national and international aid agencies and NGOs. And most of these organizations have collaborated with the people of Infierno to focus on things like capacity building in leadership and in wildlife monitoring and in micro-enterprise development and handicraft development, all things that, again, are strengthening the community's ability to manage their own resources. But there are challenges that go with ecotourism, challenges that have a tendency to debilitate these common pool resource management institutions. Though new employment has been associated with declines in resource use, new income has enabled other forms of consumption. For example, some people have reinvested their earnings into expanding their farms, buying fencing, investing in livestock, maybe even small-scale gold mining. Examples of resource use that run counter to our ideals of sustainability in a place like Infierno. I think one of the more interesting examples comes from one of the wealthiest individuals in the community who has for years worked as a chef at the lodge. And this is his annual income that is extremely high for Infierno. But only just over nearly 5,000 of that comes from his salary from the lodge or from his share of profits, just 13% of his total income. So you might ask, where is he getting all that money? How is he able to make so much money? Well, he's a clever entrepreneur. He's really savvy. He has invested some of his tourism earnings, half of them, to pay laborers. Labor is cheap, and he has paid people to work on his farm while he's working at the lodge, and effectively he's been able to expand his production, clear more forest, and harvest and plant more annuals to sell in the market. Again, here's an example of earning more income and not making it a direct incentive for conservation, but rather an opportunity to expand production in ways that may run counter to our ideals of sustainability that go with ecotourism. So greater involvement with the market economy is shifting social relations in ways that affect cooperation in Infierno as well. And this affects common pool resource management. So entrepreneurship, or becoming an impresario, as they say, has become a major theme of discussion. Some people have done this especially well, like the chef we just talked about, turning tourism profits into companies or small enterprises like fish farms or bodegas and other small businesses. The entrepreneurs tend to be admired in Infierno, but there's also concern about how such ambitions are clashing with traditional relations of equality. It used to be that everybody more or less did the same thing. Everyone was engaged in some form of farming and forest extraction, and more or less everybody earned about the same. This slide shows how among 14 households, the same 14 households between 1998 and 2006, how their income has changed. So if you see the mean income between those 14 households has nearly doubled in that time. But if you look at indicating that a number of people are doing much better, but if you look at the median household income among those same 14 households, you see a decrease, indicating that even if some people are doing much better, perhaps the majority are not. What this is essentially showing us is increased inequality associated with ecotourism. When we compare incomes from 4 households based on their primary sources of income, and we compare the earnings, we see that if your main income came from Brazil nuts because of the drop in price of Brazil nuts in that time, your income dropped quite significantly. The households engaged in these 2 cases, mostly in agriculture, income stayed more or less the same, but the guide showed an increase of nearly over 300%. So again, ecotourism associated with a greater disparity in livelihood and in income. So why does this matter? Why does this matter for commons management? Well, over the years in Infierno, I've asked people to define la buena vida, or the good life. A minority have said to me money or material goods, but most include words of peace, unity, getting along. As entrepreneurialism has gained importance in Infierno, as it's become the thing to be an impresario, gaining the most for oneself, people are now asking, how do we get along with each other? How can we maintain our buena vida with these changes? These discussions came to a head in one communal meeting. This is a photo that represents many. People had gathered to discuss how to divvy up their tourism profits for that year. Though in the past, everyone had received an equal share, in this meeting, they got into a heated debate about the fairness of that, especially because some had been able to turn those equal shares into disproportionately bigger profits. They argued whether instead communal profits should be invested purely in communal endeavors. They ultimately decided no one should receive a share that year, but rather all of it should go into a communal fund. And they justified this decision as necessary for getting along as a community. They talked very openly about how are we going to continue to exist as a community. And if you can't have a community, then it's very difficult to have an institution for managing common pool community resources. This is why I bring up this example of a way that ecotourism and changes in how people are gaining their livelihoods have the potential to debilitate a community's chances of managing resources. Finally, a challenge to commons management is what I consider a relatively new and dualistic way of thinking about nature, resources, and people in Infierno. What I've seen emerging is a mindset that reflects Western notions of wilderness, that is, places that are off limits for human use. By extension, the areas outside of reserves are increasingly described to me as open for maximum use and development. For example, the man who cleared this field on the right explained to me that he intended to use his new earnings from tourism to expand his farm. He said, Amanda, we have our reserve. You know, outside of the reserve, we can clear all of our forests. Now, I would argue this runs counter to some of our ideals about ecotourism, how we talk about ecotourism as something that can build harmonious interactions between people and nature without undermining those resources, as that quote earlier in the presentation said. But I think what's emerging in Infierno, partly in relation to ecotourism, is the idea that nature is somewhere behind the fence of a reserve or behind the rules of a reserve, and everywhere else we can act however sustainably or unsustainably. In summary, these are just 3 of the potential pros and cons of ecotourism for commons management. Though I'm sure in further research or even just in our collective experiences, we could come up with more. I've said that factors from ecotourism that favor commons management are the new earnings. They create new incentives, direct economic incentives for protecting more forest. The project management experience builds capacity of people to work together, to devise rules, and to monitor how people are using the resources and impose sanctions when those rules are broken. The expanded network of support that comes with a high-profile ecotourism operation provides more resources for people to gain even more management experience and resources, international resources to protect their commons. But then the challenges also come from new earnings. Note that new earnings are both favoring and challenging. So I said, you know, economic incentives the earnings can provide economic incentives to protect more land, but the earnings can also provide the wherewithal for people to invest in new activities that deforest or degrade the resources even faster than before. And individual entrepreneurship is creating a disparity in livelihoods and sense of wealth and how people are getting along, and that has eroded the organization that existed in Infierno before ecotourism. And then finally, this emerging idea that it's not that people live with the forest per se, or the forest, we are the wildlife. Instead, it's the forest is there where this reserve is, and everywhere else we have our town, we use resources as we want. Very much matching the disconnect that you would find in the rest of Western society. And I think that runs counter to our ideals about ecotourism. So in conclusion, what we might learn from this case is the idea that ecotourism is not merely an economic tool for conservation, but it's also a driver of a number of critical social changes. It may succeed as a community enterprise, that is in terms of profits, numbers of tourists, but at the same time, it might fail to enhance quality of life in a community or provide the foundations for effective resource management. What we need is more on-the-ground understanding, which I hope all of you will provide, and sharing of experiences to explain how and why some community enterprises manage to support commons management while others seem to create only new divisions. Thank you very much for listening to me from so far away, and I hope it was somewhat dynamic given that it's very two-dimensional, and I wish I could be there to answer your questions. But I will be delighted to answer any questions you'd like to send me by email. Marianne and Betty know how to reach me, and thank you again for listening, and I will sign off from Botswana.